How can Nintendo make Metroid big? I mean, really big. Big sales, big name recognition, cultural impact, the works, with iconic characters, a sensational plot, and so many stone-cold classic games. It seemed like Samus Aran should be on top of the world, and yet consistently sales numbers are on the low end. Metroid Dread broke records for the franchise with the last reported earnings at 2.5 million sold. No slouch, sure, but for a holiday title, launching with a new iteration of the Superstar console that's made nigh every Nintendo franchise it touches hit the big time, surely this is still a fairly meagre total. Meanwhile, Nintendo's glorious, eye-watering, fantastic remake of the absolute classic that is Metroid Prime, a game critically revered and beloved by fans, a game whose latest version has been in development for 7 years, with reportedly many big-time game developers. That game scooped in its first few weeks 1.09 million copies, albeit we're talking only a few weeks of physical sales and the game was a digital launch, but it's not exactly Tears of the Kingdom numbers. What gives? Is Samus Aran doomed to walk the sales charts in the low millions, or can Nintendo make Metroid really work for them? I think first we need to look at what success really looks like for Metroid. There are a couple of examples we can point to of where Nintendo has boosted a franchise dramatically over its baseline in recent years. Kirby has never been a huge seller for Nintendo, but it's been a consistent seller, and since it's co-owned by HAL, there has always been an impetus to put out new Kirby games. The rather workaday Kirby Star Allies, hardly a highlight in the Kirby series, sold by December 2022 4.38 million. Pretty good numbers. However, the full-effort 3D extravaganza of Kirby and the Forgotten Land rocketed to 6.46 million in its first year on the market. Evidently, the outsized success of Forgotten Land would have boosted Star Allies sales as well, but nevertheless, that's roughly a 50% increase on the series benchmark from really going for it with a 3D experience. I tried the odd demo, but I hadn't really bought a Kirby game since the original Game Boy Classic, but Forgotten Land for me was such a triumph of imagination and my highlight of 2022 that I, for one, am extremely invested in what happens in the Kirby franchise going forward if they can keep up that level of quality. And then of course there's Zelda. Twilight Princess's 5.82 million copies on the Wii and Ocarina of Time's 7.6 million copies on the N64 show the franchise could do very well for Nintendo. But I don't think even the most optimistic Hyrulean forecaster would have called Breath of the Wild hitting 31 million copies and counting, with Tears of the Kingdom almost effortlessly scooping 20 million within months of release. I've seen the argument made, not unreasonably, that Ocarina's attach rate was around 22% out of 33.29 million N64s, more than 1 in 5 own Zelda, and is the exact same percentage as Breath of the Wild's current attach rate on the Switch. However, I think that underestimates the success of Breath of the Wild on Switch. Perhaps a few N64 collectors double-dipped on the different console variants, but it would be unusual for people to have multiple systems, whereas we know that many of the sales of recent Switch systems have been to people who already own Switches, with the Lite and OLED variants. Therefore, the number of discrete players is probably quite a bit lower than the number of Switches, and that 22% therefore underestimates Breath of the Wild's pull. Basically, the attachment may be the same between the game and the consoles, but it's not necessarily the same between the games and the total number of players. But let's use this metric and go to the high watermark of Samus's bounty hunting career. The original Metroid Prime scooped 2.84 million on a console that had an install base of 21.74 million. That's a 13% attach rate. No, it's not Ocarina or Breath of the Wild numbers, but that's still a very healthy number indeed. And if a Metroid Prime game could scoop 13% on the Switch, it would have around 18 million copies sold, putting it just behind Tears of the Kingdom and fighting with New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe for the number 10 spot on Switch's all-time top seller list. But it could be argued that the player base is just too different. It could be argued that Metroid Prime was a cult hit and that sort of thing just doesn't scale. Look at Pikmin after all. The GameCube's original 1.6 million copies gave it an attach rate just north of 7%. Pikmin 4 has surpassed previous records, especially in Japan, where the game has really been pushed. But as beloved as Pikmin 4 is by fans and newcomers alike, its attach ratio is just over 2%, albeit in only 6 months on the market. In a counterfactual world where Pikmin 4 had launched in the spring of 2017 and had spent 7 glorious years on the market, would it now have the nigh on 10 million sales it would require to match its GameCube attach rate? I think that stretches credibility. So, what is Metroid's success ceiling? First, let's consider the 2D titles. Metroidvanias may be the in-genre at the moment, with Hollow Knight and Ori and the Blind Forest being acclaimed as massive hits. Personally, I have a soft spot for the underrated pinball Metroidvania, Yoku's Island Express, but while the genre may have critical support and gamer hype, it's still not all that big. Hailing Ori as probably the most successful Metroidvania ever made, Moon Studios co-founder Thomas Mahler recently confirmed the series has topped 10 million in sales with 2 games, which on the one hand is fantastic, but on the other hand, we're talking about a franchise nearly a decade old that has released on multiple platforms and whose definitive edition is currently on Switch for 3/10 the price of Metroid Dread. This is apples and oranges. Hollow Knight is another major hit, but while its numbers are astronomical by indie standards, 3 million by December 2020 puts it in the higher tier of Metroidvania's sure, but not into a completely different category. And look, to be completely blunt, Metroid Dread could not have hoped for more propitious circumstances for its launch. It doubled as a tech demo, for the perfect dart to the OLED model. It was released on the Switch, which may yet prove to be Nintendo's most successful console ever. It was critically lauded, and had been anticipated for 19 years by fans as the long-awaited conclusion of the storyline started in Metroid Fusion. I'm not saying the, by now, 3 million sales it racked up aren't great, and that, remember, without any significant discount or re-releases on other systems, but it feels broadly consistent with the upper end of these type of Metroidvanias. Metroid Prime, on the other hand, fuses traditional Metroidvania brilliance with the first-person shooter mechanics that have often found success elsewhere. Comparisons have often been drawn with the Halo series, and with over 80 million copies of Halo sold across 6 mainline titles in 20 years, Master Chief certainly appears to have earned his name. Halo was hailed as the original Xbox killer app, and with a massive 35% attach rate, that's hard to argue with, while Halo 3 scooped up 8 million sales in the US alone. Now look, Halo is a very different game, with a far more multiplayer focus. Metroid Prime 2 put its toe in the drip moat of multiplayer, as did Federation Force, and Metroid Prime 4 may aim to do its own version of multiplayer as well. But I'm not sure this kind of audience is a natural fit for Nintendo anyway. Another route for Metroid Prime is to tap into the hunger for vast, expansive and more open worlds. It can't have escaped Nintendo's notice that Breath of the Wild's success linked strongly to its degree of openness. And Zelda producer Eiji Aonuma has even gone so far as to state that linear games are of the past. This is a riskier move for Metroid Prime's core base, as while a multiplayer mode could conceivably sit alongside a core first-player experience, open-world Metroid risks going against the very essence of the tight puzzle box design. A certain segment of Zelda's audience might be upset from the move to openness, but Nintendo has overwhelming critical acclaim for the series. There is a risk, though, that if Metroid is really loved by a small, passionate crowd, that a negative reaction to the game's launch could poison the well out of the gate. Still, I think if they have a vision for a more open Metroid, and some on the rumour circuit have been suggesting that it will be very open, I think that's probably a risk they'll want to take. Open world games are big, expensive and difficult to make, and yet they are real prestige projects for a system. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are the only first-party titles that fit this bill, and another Zelda in this mould may not appear within the decade. Nintendo needs a first-party open-world title at or near the launch of its next console. It's part of a complement of games which will show the diversity of what the new system can offer. Pokemon Legends ZA may well be very open, but since the Pokemon Company is only 32% owned by Nintendo, I'm not sure they would want this to count as something they truly own. I do anticipate that the next 3D Mario will be extremely open in nature. Super Mario Odyssey and Bowser's Fury both show that the Zelda team aren't the only ones to have caught the bug of more open, sandbox experiences. But nevertheless, as beloved as Metroid Prime is, a few million copies is not going to keep Nintendo's mustachioed maverick in the style to which he's become accustomed. A more open Metroid is a gamble, but I think a gamble worth taking, and with the apparent scale of development on Metroid Prime 4, more than 5 years since its restart was announced in 2019, it would be surprising if the game weren't an order of magnitude bigger in scale than its predecessors, making Metroid a calling card title. A proof of concept of the genius of the new system worked fairly well for Metroid Dread. Dread might not have launched Metroidvanias into a whole new level of sales, but it still held the line very respectably. And with an entire console generation to sell in, I think an open-world Metroid Prime 4 should be able to reach new heights in sales history. So let's take a moment to forecast specific numbers. Assuming the next game launches on the new system and assuming it benefits from a similar proportionate sales boost for just being downright ambitious that games like Forgotten Land had after Star Allies, we might anticipate that it would do numbers, say 50% above the GameCube originals in the first 2 years of sale, which will put it into the 4 million category. Factoring in Switch's sales as well, the likelihood that some of this fanbase would double dip, I would put it at a 70% chance that within the first 2 years on sale, Metroid Prime would have sold over 4 million. But assume also that it has a successful multiplayer scene. I don't think core Halo fans are going to be tossing their Series X consoles out of the window to experience the laggy joys of some of Nintendo's online offerings, and Splatoon's Japan-centric player base have had every chance to get on board with the gunship and have kept their feet firmly planted. Metroid Dread sold 87,000 Japanese copies in its first week compared with 854,000 US copies in its first month. Not bad, but hardly the same proportions as Pikmin 4, where Japan alone accounted for 1.82 million of its 3.3 million last reported sales. But of course, Nintendo's business is 80% in the international market, and these proportions for Metroid Dread aren't massively out of whack with other endeavours. Perhaps with a good multiplayer mode and in the lull before Splatoon 4's release, Nintendo could peel off a portion of the Splatoon player base to at least give Prime 4 a shot. That could be worth another million sales, and I reckon therefore that there is a 50% chance that the game will sell 5 million or more within the first 2 years on sale. But what about the potential of thermonuclear sales for the series? Twilight Princess sold 5.82 million on Wii, with a 100 million player install base, and if you look at how Breath of the Wild quadrupled that number by the time Switch had the same amount, let's assume a fully featured, critically acclaimed, graphical powerhouse, open-world Metroid Prime launches on a system that, within 2 years should, if Nintendo don't drop the ball, have a larger install base than the GameCube's lifetime 21.74 million. If this were the case, Prime 4 should have a decent chance of crossing the 10 million mark. Now, a lot of things have to go right for this to happen, and it's out of bounds of normal Metroid expectations. Plus, it relies to a large degree on the success of the next console, which, as Nintendo knows by now from bitter experience, is by no means certain. But I'd say there is a 10% chance the next game crosses 10 million within 2 years on sale. Low chances, I grant you, but there is always hope. This takes into account one other possibility that I have yet to discuss. The new Metroid Prime game could be used to sell new hardware. In particular, the potential for any kind of VR tie-in with Metroid Prime seems almost irresistible. And even if Nintendo didn't want a VR helmet, a head strapped with a space to slot in the Switch could position Metroid Prime as the proof of concept game for a new frontier of Nintendo gaming. VR gaming is still very niche, and even the Apple Vision Pro is hardly priced at an entry level for gamers. PlayStation VR 2 has had to pause production, in fact, to clear excess inventory, and Japan especially appears to have a problem with VR-triggered motion sickness. You could say this is why Nintendo shouldn't touch with a barge pole, but another perspective is that by making VR a complementary feature of a system at an entry-level price, or at least a relatively entry-level price, they stand to crack open the VR gaming market. Lots of people are interested in VR, and if Nintendo's offering sparks something in the public imagination, Metroid Prime 4 could stand at the crest of a wave. When the media want to find an image to illustrate open-world games, time was they'd use Skyrim. Now there's a very strong chance they would use Zelda. I'm not saying it's likely, but I'm saying it's at least possible that Metroid Prime 4 could be that kind of game for virtual reality play. It relies on a lot of stars aligning, but if Metroid Prime can capture the zeitgeist in this manner, the sky really is the limit. However, it should be noticed that sales are not the only metric by which Nintendo judges success. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 launched to massive critical acclaim in 2022, and it only picked up 1.86 million sales in its first 9 months on the market, large for a Xenoblade game, but tiny for an open-world epic. Now, success for Xenoblade Chronicles is probably measured a little differently by some of its senior players. For one thing, founders Hirohide Sugiura, Tetsuya Takahashi, and Yatsuyuki Hone share 3% of the company's shares, meaning it is very much in their interest to keep pushing a property like Xenoblade that is Monolith Soft owned and created. For another, Nintendo relies on Monolith Soft so much for development on many of its games, not least Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that it is overwhelmingly in Nintendo's interest to keep burnishing Monolith Soft's reputation in the industry so that it acts as a magnet for top-tier game developers. And that reputation is far better served by being a creative force in its own right than simply an assist studio for Nintendo's legacy IP. Retro Studios, though, has the potential, in theory at least, to be a similar beacon studio for talent in America to come to Nintendo. However, there are some important differences. For one, Retro has had a far more tumultuous lifespan, with original game releases from Retro in the last decade numbering, carry the 2 out of 5, 0. They're not exactly prolific, and by all accounts their developer base has been substantially rebuilt to create Metroid Prime 4. Because Retro Studios is wholly owned by Nintendo, there's not the same financial incentive for its leaders to push out their own original IP, even if they had original IP to push. And even if Retro did serve as a way of bringing in top talent from across America, American game developers are much less likely to stay in post for a long period compared to Japanese ones. Partly as a function of the Japanese work culture where redundancies are much harder to enact, partly as a consequence of Nintendo's Kyoto-born philosophy of master craftsmanship, Nintendo developers often stay for very long periods. This makes it worth investing in developing a career there, whereas until Metroid Prime 4 drops and we can get a good look at the credits, it's still not entirely clear how drastic Retro's reconfiguration over the last decade has been. Still, Retro isn't Nintendo's only international studio, with next-level games and the oft-forgotten Nintendo software technology, let alone partner studios like Mercury Steam and WayForward, raising the profile of Nintendo's Western-developed games might yet pay dividends for recruitment and retention. Even if the baseline standard of the industry in the West is for higher turnover, this doesn't matter so much if Nintendo can attract developers who are culturally more in tune with their own philosophy. How you could select for that attributed interview, I don't know. Whether Nintendo is even interested in developing Western studios to the same degree as its Japanese partners, I couldn't begin to tell you, but the potential is definitely there for some big names in the future of game development to come through Nintendo's international subsidiaries. And of course there is one more way that Metroid makes the big time, and that is through breaking out of its box into a different medium. A Samus-themed theme park seems possible, but relatively unlikely compared to franchise stars with broader marquee appeal to families like Link and even Star Fox. Amiibo and special editions may sell at a decent clip, but are unlikely to make bank in a major way. But film and television, that's a sphere where Metroid should surely dominate. Right from its beginning it took heavy influences from the film Alien, and so it would only be fitting for Samus Aran to take to the screen. And while many games prove rather unpromising territory for adaptation, Metroid has always majored on emotion and spectacle. It's hard to remember now, but Iron Man was once a fairly middling Marvel hero whose book had kept going across a number of years, but never scored the same name recognition or sales success of many other comic book players. But one great film and one great piece of casting propelled the shellhead into the big time. And call me biased, I'll cop to the fact that I am, but Iron Man never had villains as cool as Ridley, Dark Samus, or Mother Brain. Nintendo has been incredibly cautious about its film and television ventures. While in the past they have toyed around with screen times of Kirby, Mario and others, in the era of Nintendo Studios they have moved very cautiously, with a Super Mario Bros. Movie and now a prospective Zelda project being the extent of their ambitions at the moment. In some respects, Metroid might not seem like an obvious next step for Nintendo Studios. Mario's satellite franchises like Luigi's Mansion and Donkey Kong, or other major IP like Animal Crossing might seem more ripe for development, especially when you consider the toys and merchandising empire that Animal Crossing can spin off. Still, if Zelda is a success, then presumably Nintendo will have an interest in continuing to explore live action entertainment, and since I can't imagine even Shigeru Miyamoto persuading Chris Pratt to don the prosthetics to play Fox, that leaves Metroid as the prime candidate for live-action adaptation. Now, the Zelda film may be many years away, and even if it is successful, a sequel film makes a far more logical next step than a Metroid title. Nintendo moves at a very cautious pace, and the time frame we'll be talking about for a Metroid film or television series is probably 2030 at the earliest. Far too late to help out our beloved Metroid Prime 4. Still, these multimedia conglomerates are less interested in one-and-done projects, but suites of franchises that can sustain multiple entries, and even if Metroid isn't number one on the call sheet, I think it may soon lay claim to one of the coveted "and" credits. For these reasons, I would put the likelihood of an announcement of a Metroid film or television spin-off before the end of 2027 at 30%. If you're interested in more Metroid content, please check out the video on screen or some of the playlists which are just waiting for your perusal. Thank you so much for watching Nintendo Forecast, and I will see you again next mission.